Welcome to the Hunter Report, and today is all about super mega zooms. So I've got a Sony right here and I've got a Panasonic Micro Four Thirds right here. What started this entire thing off for me is this little lens right here, which is the 100 to 300 by Panasonic. What they do want you to buy though is this 100 to 400 right here, and we're going to pit that against the Sony 100 to 400, and I have a 2x teleconverter right there. So this 100 to 400 in Micro Four Thirds is actually a 200 to 800. So we're touching on a lot of interesting topics right here. One which is Micro Four Thirds versus full frame. What are some of the pros and some of the cons of Micro Four Thirds versus full frame? Well, I'll start right off. For the same weight, right, this is about 2 pounds, you get more bang for your buck. This is a 200 to 800, whereas this baby right here is 3 pounds and you have to buy a teleconverter. So it's more expensive and it's heavier. However, you're gonna get improved image quality with a full frame camera. So these are some of the interesting topics that we're gonna touch upon in this video. I'm not gonna come to any decisive conclusions on full frame versus 4/3, but we are gonna take a really deep look at these lenses. So let's dive right into it. So the Panasonic right here is a 100 to 400, which is really 200 to 800 on a full frame. And it's a variable aperture. It's partnership with Leica, and it has stabilization in the body. All three of these have stabilization. The interesting thing about the aperture is that the max aperture on this is an f6.3, whereas with the teleconverter, right, and the Sony, at maximum length, you're actually shooting at f11. However, you have to remember that on the Sony, you're gonna have a full frame lens at f11, whereas on the Panasonic, you're gonna have a Micro Four Thirds frame all the way out at the end of the range, 800 millimeters at f6.3. So I think there's an interesting thing to go and compare. Price-wise, this is about $1,500. The Sony right here is about $2,500, and then this little baby here is. So let's go dive into it. So our first comparison is between the Leica 100 to 400 on the Panasonic and the 100 to 300 that's just Panasonic. Now I do realize there are slightly different lighting conditions in the two photos, but focus of the Chrysler building here is very similar. So that's why I chose these two photos. Now they're both at 100 millimeters, and since the lighting was so different, the f-stop was not identical, so we're at a 6.3 there, we're at a 7.1 there. But the biggest difference between these two lenses, aside from the extra 100 millimeters that you're going to get on the left here, but the biggest difference is the edge-to-edge sharpness. Now here in the middle, we're seeing a very similar focus right here on the Chrysler building. And the MetLife is looking pretty much similar as far as focus goes. Once we get to this crane right here, let me show you how just it's pretty much at the edge of the lens, right? The crane. Once you get there, you can really see that the Leica, holds a much sharper edge. Now it's practically twice the size and twice the weight of the Panasonic, of the 100 to 300. Now on the left we have the Panasonic 100 to 300, and on the right we have the Sony 100 to 400. So we already know that the 100 millimeters on the left, on the Panasonic, is the worst spot of the lens. But this is really about Micro Four Thirds versus full frame. Again, these were at different conditions. They were a few minutes apart. There was a lot of wind happening, so a real lack of control in this video, but I thought I would put it in just so you could do a little side to side. And my basic conclusion is that the Micro Four Thirds, even with the terrible focal length on it, isn't all that different from the full frame. All right, now let's just take a step back. This is some photos I took on a different day with the 100 to 300. And look at how crisp all of that chipping paint is right there. It's probably been painted over dozens of times over the last few decades. Terrible lighting that day. until this. So the sun finally came out. I checked the weather. And this is what photography really is about. Being in the right place at the right time and composing it well. And what gear you have is almost the last thing of importance. Look at that. Really crisp there. This super cool steam was coming out of a building. And look at that. We're seeing really nice details right here in the Empire State Building. Look at that. Really nice detail on the spire. So I'm okay with it. Anyway, let's get back to the comparison. All right, now we're doing Sony versus Panasonic. On the left, we have the Panasonic 100-300 at 162 millimeters, which is ×2, so that's about 324 millimeters. On the right, we're at 342, so I eyeballed this. It was pretty close, and I just tried to get the frames visually as similar as possible. And we're shooting at a 500th f14 on the right, ISO 800 on the Sony, and we're shooting... Big difference in f-stop, but keep in mind that on the Sony, you can only pretty much go to f11. That's the lowest you can go. So visually, these are extremely similar, so that's really what I care about. So the first thing we're noticing is almost identical sharpness. In fact, I'd say the Panasonic $600 lens is a little sharper than the Sony. I know the Sony is a very sharp lens. Lots of people have tested it. And don't take this as a definitive answer. But this is just showing you that as long as you're not at 100 millimeters on the Panasonic, right, we're at 162, you're going to get a really... Oh, look, that crane is very close to the edge. And let's look at this tower here. All right, almost pretty identical. Not seeing all that much more noise in the shadows of the Micro Four Thirds on the left, right? The noise in this building versus the noise here. I'd say these images are really, really similar, which is surprising for two reasons. One, we're shooting on a Micro Four Thirds on the left, and two, we're shooting on a $600 lens on the left. And you'd think that the Sony would blow it away, but these are the kind of lighting conditions, and even in the shadows, these are the kind of lighting conditions that work in the favor of the Micro Four Thirds setup. So I'm out here, and that's the Empire State Building right there. And it's a little bit twilight, and this to me is really the time where full frame shines. The thing is, the teleconverter right here on the Sony is gonna cut your light in half. So I just want to see if there's any difference. So on the right we have the Sony 100-400, and on the left we have the Panasonic. Now with the Panasonic we're shooting at f6.3 125 400 millimeters ISO 1600, and we are shooting f11 1/160th 800 millimeters at ISO 12.5. So very similar, almost identical settings between both. I tweaked them just so that they would look about the same exposure, but anyway, very similar settings. So the purpose of this test is really Micro Four Thirds versus full frame. Well, out here looks very much the same. You know, traffic lights are a different color. Now the focus is definitely better on the Sony, but I didn't take enough shots, and I suspect, I mean, I'm shooting at oh yeah, look at that. I'm shooting at 1/125th, so that's the explanation for that. At 800 millimeters, I mean, there was not a lot of light, so I was really pushing, and I didn't want to jack the ISO up that high. Maybe I should have. But I'm going to attribute the lack of focus to the slow shutter speed. But the main purpose of this test was really to look at the shadows. Now I've pushed the shadows here on the Sony in raw editing on this ARW file. And I'm just seeing really similar shadows. I mean, you look at this right here, you look at this right here. So I'm not seeing a huge difference between full frame and Micro Four Thirds. Now, so those are pretty harsh lighting conditions, right? That was twilight. You can get harsher, right? You could shoot in pure night, and there definitely may be some advantages to going full frame. But you're gonna need the proper lens, and a 100-400 teleconverter, remember, it gets you to f11, your minimum aperture with the teleconverter on the Sony. So you're gonna need a lens sort of like this from Sigma, which gives you a f5 to 6.3 all the way out through the range. And that doesn't even exist for Sony, so you need to shoot that on a converting mount, which is never great. But if you really need to push things, right, like you're on a safari or you're shooting sports and you have the budget for it, sure, you're gonna get a little more on full frame. But is it a diminishing return? I sort of think so. Let's get back to this photo series that I shot on the 100-300. I mean, photography is about being in the right place at the right time, having great composition, knowing what a shot is. I mean, I spent like an hour up on this bridge. Once the sunlight really got going, I'm like, oh my God, I'm in the right place, I have the right equipment, or good enough equipment, and it's definitely the right time. So, like, I would stop every 5 feet and just boom, look at that incredible sky, and look at that incredible, I just got lucky there. And then this with a micro four thirds, I mean, beautiful shadow detail, looks very crisp to me. I mean, look at all that great detail in the Empire State Building spire. This was super late at night. Look at that, I pushed it 1/160th of a second. I even went, this was handheld. I literally stabilized against a fence. I was up on the bridge, and I took, I don't know, 40 shots, right, on rapid fire, and this is the one that was in focus. This is at 1/125th at 300 millimeters, which is really 600 millimeters. And this was on a tripod. And look how crisp everything is. I mean, you could see a star right there. All right, so let's just go down the line of the features. First of all, price. Panasonic 100-300, $600. I think it's the deal of the century. You got the Panasonic 100-400. You know, it's about $1,600. And you got the Sony 2500 plus the teleconverter for another $500. So you're looking at $3,000 on the Sony side for an f11. All of them have some form of image stabilization. The 100-300 actually has a better aperture when it's fully extended, although it's 300 millimeters as opposed to 400. Here's another important factor: weight. 1 pound, 2 pounds, and 3 pounds. I can tell you that my 100-300, and I rented these other two lenses, but my 100-300, it's so light that I can walk with it. Once you're getting into the 2 pound range, especially how long it is, like, it's just not as comfortable to walk with. That said, if you need those optical results, that extra sharpness, it might be the lens for you. And then the Sony is just in a whole other ballgame. If you don't own a micro four thirds system, then the Sony might be your only option. But you could probably, for this $600 lens, you could probably get a micro four thirds system and this $600 lens for the price of the Sony 100-400 plus the teleconverter. So that's something to think about. So my verdict, I'm a huge fan of small crop factor cameras, micro four thirds, and I even love 1-inch sensors with their super zooms, sort of like the Sony RX10, which has just a great super zoom. And it's a really good balance between portability and decent image quality on the 1-inch sensor size. And then the micro four thirds gives you even more image quality. Now, you can't get as wide. You know, you're sort of limited as to the how wide angle lenses are made for micro four thirds. So there's another downside. And you're going to get slight depth of field differences. But given that Panasonic's micro four thirds system shoots 10-bit video, I think it's a really serious competitor and a really good value for dollar. Super lightweight, super compact, pretty high image quality, as high image quality as you need as if you're willing to pay for it in terms of price and weight and size. And for everything but the most extreme conditions like night and sports, I think that Micro Four Thirds is going to take care of you just fine, even for professional use. So thank you so much for tuning in. If you found any of this useful, I would appreciate so much if you subscribed and gave me a thumbs up. Check the description below if you want to get any of these items, and enjoy shooting.